So good evening, everybody. Welcome to McNally Jackson. I'm sorry that the weather kept so many people at home and we have such a small turnout, but I'm sure Zadie understands. Welcome. We have obviously a very exciting event tonight. Zadie Smith is one of the most talented literary voices of our generation. He's a multi-award winning author of White Teeth, The Autograph Man, On Beauty, Changing My Mind Tonight, Swing Time. In this ambitious, exuberant novel, we meet two brown girls who dream of being dancers, but only one, Tracy, has talent. The other has ideas about rhythm and time, about black bodies and black music, what constitutes a tribe, or makes a person truly free. It's a close but complicated childhood friendship that ends abruptly in their early 20s, never to be revisited, but never quite forgotten either. The New Yorker calls it her most affecting novel in a decade. Please give a very warm welcome to our guest, Zadie Smith.
Hello, hi. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to read for a bit, and then we're going to have questions. That's all that's happening this evening. So this is two chapters from the middle. The book is about these two girls in the 80s in England, and it's also set partly in West Africa. So these are two chapters back to back from those two worlds. And this section is titled The Middle Passage. It's about that bit between childhood and adulthood. And in this section, the narrator is actually a grown woman on a trip in West Africa. The greatest dancer I ever saw was the kangaroo. But in the moment, I didn't know who or what it was. A wildly swaying orange shape of a man's height but without a man's face, covered in many swishing, overlapping leaves. Like a tree in the blaze of a New York fall that uproots itself and now dances down the street. A large gang of boys trailed behind it in the red dust, and the phalanx of women with palm leaves in their hands, their mothers, I assumed. The women sang and stepped heavily, beating the air with the palms, walking and dancing both. I was squeezed into a taxi, a beat-up yellow Mercedes with a green stripe running down its middle. Lamin, my guide, was next to me in the back seat, alongside somebody's grandfather, a woman feeding a squalling baby, two teenage girls in their uniforms and one of the Quranic teachers from the school. It was a scene of chaos that Lamin met calmly, ever conscious of his status as a trainee teacher, his hands folded priestly on his lap, looking as always, with his long, flat nose and broad nostrils and sad, slightly yellowed eyes, like a big cat in repose. The car stereo played reggae from my mother's island, turned up to a crazy volume. But whatever was coming towards us was dancing to rhythms reggae never approaches. Beats so fast, so complex that you had to think about them or see them expressed through the body of a dancer to understand what you were hearing. Otherwise you might mistake it for one rumbling bass note. You might think it was the sound of thunder overhead. Who was drumming? I looked out of my window and spotted 3 men, their instruments gripped between their knees, walking like crabs. And when they scuttled in front of our car, the whole travelling dance party paused in its forward momentum, took root in the middle of the road, forcing us to stop. It made a change from the checkpoints, the sullen, baby-faced soldiers, their machine guns held loosely at the hip. When we stopped for soldiers, often a dozen times in a single day, we'd fall silent. But now the cab exploded in talk and whistles and laughter, and the schoolgirls reached out the window and jimmied the broken handle until the passenger door opened and everyone except the breastfeeding woman tumbled out. What is it? What's happening? I was asking Lamin. He was supposed to be my guide, but he seemed to barely remember I existed. I didn't matter now. There was only the present moment, only the dance. And Lamin, as it turned out, was a dancer. I spotted it in him that day. I saw it in every hip swivel and each nod of his head. But I couldn't see the orange apparition anymore. There was such a crowd between me and it that I could only hear it. What must have been its feet pounding the ground, and the raw clang of metal on metal, and a piercing shriek otherworldly to which the women replied in song as they too danced. I was dancing involuntarily myself, pressed up close to so many moving bodies. I kept asking my questions, what is it, what's happening? But English, the official language, that heavy, formal coat people only put on in my presence, and even then with obvious boredom and difficulty, had been thrown to the ground. Everyone was dancing on it, and I thought, not for the first time in that first week, of the adjustment my employer would have to make when she finally arrived to discover, as I already had, the chasm between what they call a viability study and life as it appears before you on the road, in the ferry, in the village and the city, within the people, in a half-dozen languages, in the food, faces, the sea, the moon, the stars. People were clambering onto the car for a better view. I looked for Lamin and found him too scrambling up onto the front bonnet. The crowd was dispersing, laughing, screaming, running, and I thought at first that a firecracker must have gone off. A group of the women fled leftwards, and now I saw why. The kangarang wielded 2 machetes long as arms. "Come!" cried Lamin, reaching a hand down for me, and I pulled myself up to him, clinging to his white shirt as he danced, trying to keep my balance. I looked down at the frenzy below. I thought, here is the joy I've been looking for all my life. Directly above me, an old woman sat decorously on the roof of our car, eating a bag of peanuts, looking like a Jamaican lady at Lord's following a day's cricket. She spotted me and waved. "Good morning. How is your morning?" The same courteous, automatic greeting that followed me around the village, no matter what I wore, no matter who I was with, and which by now I understood as a nod to my foreignness, which was obvious to everyone everywhere. She smiled mildly at the machetes as they spun, at the boys who kept daring each other to approach the dancing tree and match its moves, while steering clear of those circling knives, imitating in their own narrow bodies the convulsive stamps and twists and crouches and high kicks and general rhythmic euphoria that radiated from the figure to all points on the horizon, through the women, through Lamin, through me, through everyone I could see, as beneath us the car shook and rolled. She pointed at the kangarang. "It is a dancer," she explained. A dancer who comes for the boys, taking them to the bush, where they're circumcised, initiated into their culture, told the rules and the limits, the sacred traditions of the world in which they'll live, the name of the plants to help with this or that illness and how to use them. Who acts as threshold between youth and maturity, wards off evil spirits, is the guarantor of order and justice and continuity between and within his people. He is a guide who leads the young through their difficult middle passage from childhood to adolescence, and he is also simply a young man himself, anonymous, chosen in great secrecy by the elders, covered in the leaves of the furrow tree and stained with vegetable dyes. But I learnt all this on my phone, back in New York. I did try to ask my guide about it at the time, what it all meant, how it fit into or diverged from local Islamic practice, but he couldn't hear me over the music, or didn't want to hear me. I tried a little later, after Kankarang had moved on elsewhere, and we were all squeezed back into the cab along with 2 of the young dancing boys. They lay across our laps, sticky with the sweat of their efforts. But I could see my questions were annoying to everybody, and by then the euphoria was over. And Lamin's depressing formality, which he brought to all his dealings with me, had returned. A Mandinka tradition, he said, and then turned back to the driver and the rest of the passengers to laugh and argue and discuss things I couldn't guess in a language I didn't know. We drove on. I wondered about the girls. Who comes for the girls? If not the Kankarang, who? Their mothers? Their grandmothers? A friend? When my friend Tracy's time came, there was no one to guide her over the threshold, to advise her, or even tell her that this was a threshold she was crossing. But her body was developing quicker than anybody else's, and so she had to improvise, to make her own arrangements. Her first idea was to dress wildly. Her mother was blamed, mothers usually are. But I'm sure her mother barely saw or knew the half of it. She was still asleep when Tracy left for school, not home when she got back. She'd found some work finally. I think she was cleaning an office block somewhere. But my mother and the other mothers disapproved of her employment almost as much as they disapproved of her unemployment. Before she'd been a bad influence, now she was never home. Both her presence and her lack of presence was no good somehow. And the way they began to speak of Tracy took on a tragic dimension. For isn't it only tragic heroes who have no choices before them, no alternative routes, only unavoidable fates? In a few years, Tracy would be pregnant, according to my mother, and so would drop out of school, and the cycle of poverty would complete itself, ending most probably in prison. Prison ran in the family. Of course, prison ran in my family too, but somehow I was linked to a different star. I would be and do none of these things. My mother's certainty about all this worried me. If she was right, it meant her dominion over other people's lives extended far beyond anything I'd up till now imagined. And yet, if anyone might defy fate, as presented in the form of my mother, surely Tracy could manage it. But the signs were bad. Now when Tracy was asked to take her coat off in class, she no longer refused, instead performing the action with a terrible relish, unzipping slowly and in such a way that her breasts were presented to the rest of us with as much impact as possible, barely contained by an unsuitable top that showed off her abundance, where the rest of us had only nipple and bone. Everybody knew it cost 50p to touch Tracy's tits. I had no idea whether that was true or not, but all the girls united in shunning her, black, white and brown. We were nice girls. We didn't let people touch our non-existent tits. Now we had boyfriends chosen for us by other girls in notes passed from desk to desk or in long, torturous phone calls. You want to know who fancies you and told everyone he fancies you. And once these boyfriends had been formally assigned, we stood solemnly with them in the playground in the thin winter sun, hand in hand, more often than not a head taller than them, until the inevitable moment came for us to break up, and the timing of that too was decided by our friends, and the round of notes and calls would begin again. You couldn't take part in this process without belonging to a clique of willing females, and Tracy had no girlfriends left, only me, and only then when she chose to be friendly. She took to spending her break times in the boys' football cage, sometimes cursing them, even picking up the ball and stopping play, but more often than not acting as their accomplice, laughing with them as they teased us, never attached to any boy in particular, and yet, in the school's imagination, freely handled by all. If she saw me through the bars, playing with Lily or doing double dutch with the other black and brown girls, she'd make a show of turning and talking with her male circle, whispering with them, laughing, as if she too had an opinion on whether or not we wore bras or had started our periods. Once when I was walking past the football cage in a very dignified way, hand in hand with my new boyfriend, Paul Barron, the policeman's son, she stopped what she was doing, gripped the bars of the cage and smiled out at me. Not a nice smile, a deeply sarcastic smile, as if to say, "Oh, is that who you're pretending to be now?" That's it, thank you. Hey, so quiet out there. Can I answer any questions? Hey, yeah, at the back.
Swing time France, do you read aloud what you've written to get a sense of whether there's rhythm in the way that you like?
The only thing I read aloud subconsciously is the dialogue. I think it's quite common. I heard a friend of mine, Eddie St. Aubin, who wrote those wonderful Melrose books, saying that when he writes his various wives would complain about this voice coming out of the study. He did all those voices. So I think some writers who are kind of dialogue heavy do that. It's just an instinctive thing. And also that the dialogue is written quickest, because in some way, if you like dialogue, it's the easiest part. Yeah, at the back.
I know this is fiction, but it's so spot on. I was wondering where you got your inspiration for your characters, like especially since the biracial experience is something that's very popular, like narratives and literature and everything. So, your own personal experience, or is it
I think it depends where you live. In my neighbourhood, being mixed race was as common as chips. So yeah, there was a lot of us, one way or another, and we have had some notable examples recently, not least the man running the country for the next 5 days. But I don't think of it as a kind of particular consciousness you could perfect or study, or I don't really think of groups of people in that way. But I do recognise a kind of commonality, when I meet other mixed race girls. I've been on book tour recently, and a girl gave me a zine she'd made called White Dads. It's an amazing zine. All her friends who have white dads had given something, a poem or a story or a photograph, and described the experience of having a white dad, which amused me a lot. But that shows there's enough people to even make a zine on such a topic. But for me, there's always bits of personal experience, but it's more like a kind of hypothetical, like what if I was me but everything had happened differently? It's more like acting, like being an actor. What would it be like if all the circumstances were various, different than they were? Yeah.
Hi. For the narrator,
Yeah.
I wanted so much more for her.
Right.
And I wanted to know if that was a feeling that you wanted your readers to feel for her.
Yeah, I wanted to resist the idea of I know exactly what you mean, but I think that the culture is full of these role models and examples of people with very large personalities that are projected out of you in an aspirational way. And I didn't want her to be one of those people. No. I wanted to talk more about what it's like to exist. not as a presentation, not as a role model, not just as somebody moving through time. And I thought it also, personally in my life I've been very influenced by the slightly unfashionable French existentialists, though I see they're having a bit of a moment maybe, Sarah Bakewell, his book's coming out again. But the idea that it's existence that precedes essence, it's what you do and how you're thrown into the world that matters to me a lot. And obviously that is at odds with the kind of identity politics, which is about essential qualities in people. So my life is a kind of ping-ponging between those two ideas. I don't disagree with any of them exclusively, but I suppose I can't get on board wholly with the idea of a person as an identity, as in any way fixed, So the main character, I think the shock for her is that she has to describe herself and judge herself on what she's done. It turns out what she's done isn't that great. And that can be quite painful, realising that. That's a kind of adult realisation. Yeah. At the back in the grey shirt, yeah.
Time is a big theme, and I wondered how you see us experiencing time through the internet and books.
I was quite subject to this when I was writing it, because there's a lot of technology in the book, nostalgic technology, I guess, old VHS tapes, old, rotary phones, old stuff. And then as it nears, I think the book ends in 2008 with the financial crash, so this technology starts to come to the fore. But I radically mistook when the technology came. And then I noticed when it was going through copy edit that all my copy editors also radically missed it or would only get it very late. And that really interested me, that idea. It's not really, I didn't have time to put it in the novel because it was a late realisation of mine. But that the technology creates a kind of amnesia about time. So people have very strange ideas about when they started Googling on their phones, what historical events were happening when they were Googling on their phones, what they could do on their phones in 2008, 2009. That all really fascinates me, that it creates a kind of eternal now, where it seems like this has just been going on forever. And so it presents a challenge for people born before 2000 who are trying to bring things into historical context without being accused of being a Luddite or not understanding the present moment. I find that quite strange. And I was shocked by it in myself, a tendency to forget the history and forget that this technology is extraordinarily new and changing the way we feel about time because it's keeping us in this flat present in which all things exist at the same moment. But some things are wonderful about it, like, I don't know, maybe the first cultural example I saw of it was a rap group, Odd Future. And I realised I was listening to rappers for whom all time just is at the same moment. There's no history in it, it's just they experienced it online, so it's all happening at the same moment, and the music, you can feel it in the music. So there's a kind of collage feel to it, which is interesting. But I think politically it turns out to have some problems now. Yeah. At the back. Yeah.
Do you think that you've noticed a different response to your book regionally, like where you're from versus coming to America with our political climate and how race relations are in our country?
I think there remains in England a sense of when anyone mentions anything about their ethnicity, oh, do you have to? It's just not. Do we have to talk? Can't we just get over? You know, there's a lot of that in England. And some of it has become quite striking to me. Like recently in England, a very nice lady and writer and comedian pulled out of a prize that had been expressly, literary prize created for people of colour because she said she felt she was being read for her skin and not her book. And that's the kind of mindset which is quite common there, I think. Given that this prize was trying to do something to highlight writers who are almost always ignored by British mainstream publishing, it seems like kind of a self-harm to then disavow it. But there is the idea that any word of ethnicity is a kind of flattening of yourself, is kind of romanticism, right? And I feel that that's less true in America. Like it's possible to conceive of a self who considers their ethnicity and still considers themselves a person who's not trying to flatten themselves out. But I think for me in England there's an idea of neutrality that comes with whiteness, and then everything else is a kind of exotic elaboration you're putting on top. And obviously I can't feel that because I am this person. So yeah, for me America, with all its racial difficulties, is still a conversation that's being had, at least, let's put it that way. Yeah, with beard.
Kind of on a similar vein, you write over and over again about race and about gender. And I know if I were writing about those topics, I mean, obviously I'd be writing from a very different perspective than you, but I know I'd be terrified to write anything just because it's so impossible to write about those things without somebody finding them offensive, somebody calling them problematic, no matter how you do it.
No, people are constantly being offended by what I write. That's okay.
Yeah,
but I think you know that's some of the risk of art generally. No, there's formal offence, there's content offence, there's the authenticity offence, which is the one you're talking about. But there's many different versions. You know, a style can offend just at the level of sensibility. Like I find your realism monstrous. You know, that's the risk of writing. So I just add it to all the very many other risks that come with writing from a particular place. But I suppose I also sometimes, you know, if I get into the skin of a white man in his late 50s, like Howard in On Beauty. It almost offends me that no one's offended, but I realise that the idea is that white culture is so, you know, indomitable that me being in his skin is not going to threaten anybody, because who cares? Like, I can appropriate as much as I like his stuff, because his stuff is rock, but if someone borrows something from me, I'm such a vulnerable soul that I will fall on the floor and die. I don't feel that way personally, and I don't get offended at art from that perspective, but I do get offended at bad art, and sometimes that falls under the aegis of bad art. No, it's just badly done. The rule of doing it well is the final principle, I think. But then you can't defend it. There will always be someone who can peel off and say, no, not for me. But I don't mind that. Yeah.
This is obviously your first book in the first person, and elsewhere you've said that it was somewhat limiting and that you didn't name your narrator to have sort of more freedom. Maybe you could talk about some of the other freedoms maybe you experienced as writing in the first person, if there are any.
I think it's not so much freedom, but the interest that people are so convinced by the first person. it has such a strong reality effect that that's something very powerful you can play with, you know. Some of it has weird side effects. Like, I really did have people I didn't know so well, like distant friends emailing me and saying, "I'm so sorry, did your mother die?" No, my mother's not dead. But because they read it in that very close way. So that was quite fun. I'd never really done that before. The idea of lying, using a speech act, which people kind of instinctively take as truth, you know. When you say I, people are very wedded to the idea that if you say I, you're speaking the truth. So I was just very inspired by, like, obviously long first-person narratives like Ferrante, like Nausgard, but they'd had this compulsive reality effect. I think anybody who writes knows how completely constructed those narratives are. But it's interesting that at this moment they felt like confession. I think confession is one of the oldest literary forms. It's very powerful. So it was a fun thing to use. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the intersection of dancing and writing as
Right.
art forms in springtime, because, I mean, writing, it's on the page, it exists 3 years afterwards, but dancing is so ephemeral, and I felt this sort of visceral physicality to it
Right.
in springtime, so I just wanted to ask about the process of that.
I mean, I think that's part of diasporic, African diasporic culture suffered from that elusiveness of dance. No, it's one of our greatest cultural creations, and for centuries it existed in people's memories. Or I saw this person dance. Or I saw. I was very struck by that idea, and also by a dancer, a tap dancer actually, who I was reading an interview with her, and she mentioned the idea that with a slave, for example, you take everything from the slave, all property, all belongings, also the drum, leaving him or her only with her body, right? That's all she has left, both to make art and also to mark time. Tap dancing is very much about marking time, dividing it, the musicality of it. So I started to think of it as like a written thing. It's written on the body, to use that old 80s phrase from my grad classes. But it's that kind of language, something I really love about it. And then I started thinking about video artists, you know, of the 80s who really took those dances and froze them so you could see them at any moment, at any time. So all those thoughts were in my mind. Much smarter than me, I'm rambling about it, but a friend of mine who reviewed Swingtime at one point in Harper's, she said that dance is basically embodiment of embodiment. It's true. Like all the other arts, you're trying to embody something in another form. So you want to embody a certain feeling and paint in words, in music. When you embody something in your body, you physically do it. So it's a very unusual art form from that point of view. And it's really hard to verbalise, like, what is the difference, the feeling of watching Michael Jackson compared to watching Bojangles, compared to watching Martha Graham. Like, I feel, dance critics got a hard job, man, because you know it. When I say it, everyone's nodding, you feel it, but it's hard to put into this other form. But I love that about it, and I guess I thought of it as a kind of challenge to try and pinpoint what I loved in it. Yeah, with the glasses.
That narrows it down. I teach high school English, and I wanted to know what advice you can give to me so that I have more writers that are as talented as you who lead my classroom.
Thank you. I went to a pretty, a kind of rough school, and the thing that I noticed about it was unusual. I didn't come away with a lot of other things I can't add, and until recently I couldn't speak a language. A lot of things I can't do, but in the English department was very, very good. And one of the things I noticed about it is that it did not cater to us in the sense of giving us things that it thought were suitable for us in the obvious way. Like because of the curriculum, had to do a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of 19th century fiction. And then there were books that spoke to us more personally, which were really important to 20th century books by people of colour. Not enough, but some. But it was a really interesting experience to do, say, Antony and Cleopatra, in my GCSE class, with a lot of kids who were not they were gonna leave, the next year, or they left halfway through. But that was a really intense experience, and I don't think it could be assumed that group of kids could have such a close attachment to that text, but they loved it, they really loved it. And it was a really deep reading experience. Just the time we had to read and discuss before we got into anything like what we would need for the test, It It was a different time, but I found those classes really foundational. And just teachers who were able to suggest, in that Baldwin sense, that Keats is also mine, you know, and that Shakespeare's mine, even Chaucer in this class was also mine. I think that's a very bold view. That was Baldwin's view, and I think it's true from a kind of humanist point of view. There are things that you feel close to in the sense of family, tribal, Jamaican writing I care about, English writing I care about, but there's also the cultural product of human beings which belong to you. I think it's kind of important to let kids know that. Yeah.
Hi. I've been wondering about the way you construct your character's personality from the first book I read from you, and especially in White Teeth, because you've been talking about the way you embody like a white 50-year-old man, and how comfortable or not you can be doing so. But I was wondering if the amount of research you have to do, for example, in White Teeth, to understand and be able to transcribe the Indian family, the Indian woman, the kids,
Right.
or is it much more in your imagination, and how confident you can be, especially when you were in your early 20s when you wrote that?
I kind of came from a place of not really believing that people in terms of human personalities can be researched in a strict sense. I feel very strongly about that, and also when I'm teaching now, I have to remind my students sometimes of the stupidity of the subject of English literature. It's a fundamentally stupid subject. You're not doing physics here, and we're not doing any kind of science or technology, we're doing English. And we can have beautiful, complex conversations, but we mustn't forget the kind of basis of it, which is very unfirm. I like to remind my students of that so they can feel easy. And when I'm writing, I feel that same way. That it seems to me an absurdity to imagine, for instance with the Bengali family in White Teeth, I could read a certain amount of books about the history of Bangladesh and I would then be right in that portrayal. I don't believe in that. I also feel the kind of over-research that goes on into cultural particulars belies the way that people themselves experience their cultures. Because every Muslim boy walking down the street does not know the Quran back to front. Every Jamaican girl does not know the history of Jamaica. You have a partial knowledge of what you call your culture. Sometimes, to be honest, a really half-assed knowledge of what you supposedly call your culture. So I'm trying to recreate that, you know. Like Minat and Majid were really imperfect in all ways. They were imperfect when they got religion, imperfect when they were trying to be secular. They were just people. You can make technical errors, not this meal, not this holy day, but I think they're very small and matter very little compared to the gain of taking the risk and imagining what such a life is like. And then I suppose the other kind of lame humanist liberal assumption underneath it is something like people are not that different. They're not that different. I do retain that thought, so I work from that too. Yeah.
So, as the biracial daughter of an immigrant, your books have been really important to me. So
thank you.
so much for writing them. And I noticed there aren't a lot of prominent biracial writers who let their identity show so strongly in their work. Have you ever been criticized for your commentary on like race, nationality, gender?
I'm sure. You know, I'm 41 now, so I avoid a lot of it. I'm not like online in the comment section anymore. I think the interesting thing about, I mean, it's nothing, being biracial isn't that interesting, but maybe the interesting thing about it is that you have a kind of intimate identity and a political identity. Like when I was reading this zine, White Dads, I was really moved by how, these were young girls and boys, you know, they're only like 18, 19, 20, young college kids, trying to figure themselves out. And in every piece, whether it were poetry or prose or a non-fiction thing, they felt this tension between what they considered a kind of political, I suppose, African-American identity and the fact they had this white dad. Like, that was a hard thing for them to put together in their minds. But to me, I think what's interesting about it is that it mirrors a problem that everybody has, that you have to speak politically is to speak from a very firm, usually singular point. In order to have power, you know, you have to gather with other people and say, we are this, we are the Union of Kitchen Workers, or we are the, you go with your banner on the march. But everyone on the banner at the march feels like, well, I am that, but also there's other things going on in my life, more intimate things, things which are hard to put on a banner. I also don't agree with the banner behind me. There's always that tension between the circle of your intimate life and this political statement. But I think it kind of pained me to see the kids in this zine, and I guess more widely sometimes on the internet, tearing each other apart. You know, tearing each other down, also saying, well, your political identity isn't as firm as mine, or I see in your intimate life there is this incoherence. It's like, yeah, no shit, that's what life is like. And to imagine yourself as this coherent identity all the time is really a stressful thing to put on anybody. It's like being a politician in your personal life all day long. So I reject that role as a citizen and as a writer. I wouldn't be capable of it anyway. I have all kinds of inappropriate thoughts. Yeah.
Hi. What have you learned from the people you've created?
Oh God, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess a lot of the women are a bit bolder than I am. I feel brave. I don't know if they make you brave retrospectively. Not really. Like I remember writing Kiki. I didn't really become more Kiki-ish. But I guess it's good to know that somewhere in you have these capacities or these arguments. I think it's the practice of writing that teaches you something more. It's you know, I'm so much more judgmental in my life. You know, I spend the whole time slagging everybody off. But in fiction, you have to. I have a kind of impulse to say, oh, but then, you know, like if I'm writing Howard's obviously an arse in many ways, but then there's lots of things about him which are okay, you know, and I guess I'm comparing them to me and thinking, well, I'm no better than that a lot of the time. Same with Amy in this book, I guess. Amy, the pop star who kidnaps a baby, sorry, spoiler. But, you know, there are days I kidnap a baby. I love babies. And so it's that kind of, you know, knowledge, trying to remember the limits of how good you are. It's a good influence on your characters, on broadening them.
Got time for one more?
Great. Hi, at the very back, yeah.
What's your favorite jazz piece?
Jazz. Jazz is my husband's department, to be honest. Hip-hop is my department. But singer, I mean, it's such a boring answer, but Billie Holiday to me is my favourite singer, one of my favourite artists in any form. So I did a thing recently, actually, I don't know if it's out yet, it's coming out, I think. It's a book of beautiful photographs of Billie from the 50s, when she did an engagement in Jersey, when things were going really awful. Like it was really awful, not long before she died, and it was a terrible gig, and the beautiful photographs, and so I got to write the introduction, and instead of writing a formal introduction, I kind of wrote more in her voice, and it was such a joy. Of all the characters I've had a chance to voice, to be Billie Holiday for 4 pages was really awesome. So she's my favourite noise in the world, yeah, to hear her. Thank you, I'm going to sign. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So obviously we could ask a million questions, but I want to make sure that everybody who would like to say hello and get a book signed has a chance to do that. So if you give us just 1 minute, I'm going to set Zadie up, and you are welcome to grab a book and get it signed, and then pay for it upstairs. Go ahead. Can you please get me some Post-its and a handful of pens? Thank you.